Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I am Bob Allison, president of the Society. The Society was formed in the early 1890s to study early American history. Our period goes up to 1820. And we host gatherings like this several times a year. We mainly publish primary documents of early American history, including, I am reminded tonight, the volume of Debt to Shays, which was co-edited by my learned colleague, Bob Gross. Bob Gross, as you probably know, is the author of The Minutemen and Their World, really one of the definitive books about the American Revolution. And he and I are going to discuss Loyalists, Patriots, and other things. And we'll see where it goes. And we welcome any questions, comments, other things from members of the audience. So welcome to Professor Gross.
So, well, thank you, and thank you all for coming out. Let me tell you something of the origins of this session. I made a casual remark to my fellow Bob that we should have a conversation. He could be a loyalist, I'd be a patriot, we would debate positions. Next thing I know, I get a call. Could we set up a session? I was just trying to pass the time of day. But, yeah, I said, sure. And then the time draws near, and I realized, this is a bad idea. Not bad in that anyone who wears a bow tie like that is a perfect historical reenactor. Rather, if I was to be the patriot, who's a representative patriot? Would I be in the Sons of Liberty in 1765, sitting in the Green Dragon Tavern and applauding the crowds that forced stamp masters to resign and having another drink to complain about the mob that tore down Thomas Hutchinson's house? Or would I be a latecomer to the patriot movement? In fact, it wasn't a patriot movement until 1774-75, when the Provincial Congress assembled and seized the reins of government from General Gage. It wasn't a patriot movement, then there wasn't a loyalist movement. Because a good many people who were loyalists had earlier in the protest movement expressed their own unhappiness with taxation without representation or with violations of the Constitution. So that was a real difficulty. And I thought, how do we be reenactors of something about which we're terribly ambivalent? Besides being ambivalent reenactors. But then came the problem, who's a loyalist? And one of the largest groups of loyalists, not in Massachusetts, but in most of the other colonies, were people of color who answered Lord Dunmore's call in Virginia and other governors' calls to join the British forces and gain their freedom. But loyalist studies seldom foreground black people. Though in Massachusetts, the majority of black soldiers were patriots. So this became a difficulty in our thinking, how would we plausibly debate in the persons of these historical actors? So instead we thought we'd have a discussion of patriots and loyalists, but invite you all to join in at any time. They don't have to wait for question and answer period or for drinks to be served again.
See, I had thought this was your idea. And he balked at actually wearing the costume of dressing as either a patriot or a loyalist. And you're right, I don't want people to think from his peroration that we actually don't know who were Patriots or Loyalists, and thus we won't have anything to talk about. I know in this room there are people who do know a lot about Patriots and Loyalists, so I do hope people will join in. But he's absolutely right, and these identities do shift. If we can even call them identities, people's points of view, perspectives shift. I know that a couple of our graduate forum alums have been working on the networks of the Loyalists who leave, but they maintain connections with people in Massachusetts. And then they use these family connections. Christina Carrick and Patrick O'Brien are writing about these family connections that they established to maintain trade links with Massachusetts. It really is a way of benefiting the family, as well as benefiting the emerging United States, as well as the emerging British Empire. And we do see different points when people are making these decisions. And someone, sometimes students say that someone, or you see someone became a loyalist. Well, they always were loyalists. And patriot's a misnomer because a lot of the loyalists also love their country. And so it's unfortunate for the loyalists that becomes the name by which they're known. They're not the patriots, meaning they didn't love their country, but it might have been fear of what was going to happen. Someone like John Dickinson, who's one of the leading writers of the 1760s, his Farmer's Letters was one of the first great calls for not taxing the Americans and why Americans should be able to govern themselves. And it's really one of the real testaments. They're reading this in the 1770s, 1780s, but he doesn't sign the Declaration because he knows this is probably not going to work. We're probably going to lose. Do we really want to declare independence if we know the consequences? So you have all of this ambivalence inherent in this whole story, which should make us rethink how we easily put people into categories. And Samuel Adams, I think, was probably a patriot all along.
But part of the problem that just hit me as you were talking is that the term patriot is already biased. A patriot is the ideal type of Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood. Patriot sacrifices self-interest, comfort, anything that would sustain everyday life for the greater cause. So to call someone a patriot is already to bias the case in their favor. With a loyalist, there's good loyalty to family, but we all know there's not so good loyalty to bad causes. So the very names we have create an asymmetry in our general understanding.
So should we think of different names?
Yes.
Should this be the contribution of the 250?
Yes. So part of the problem, especially in Massachusetts, is that in the historical understanding, we can say that people acted on interests or on ideas or principles, or more generally ideology, or on interests. And for the most part, the historiography of the American Revolution in Massachusetts is all about principles. As soon as you get to New York, Wall Street, Philadelphia, it's all about interests,
right,
except Quakers. They got principle.
And they stay out of it.
And they stay out. And it's really important because when you pause on this, Concord's all about principle, supposedly. But Marblehead, whose sailors and merchants in the fisheries were devastated by the British Fisheries Act, which closed the North Atlantic fishing grounds to Massachusetts and other colonies. They were acting on a shared economic interest. But then Nantucket is the center of the whaling trade. And they're going to be neutral in the Revolution because they're so vulnerable to British attack, and Massachusetts has no navy capable of withstanding that. So who's acting on self-interest? And is that patriotic? And who's acting on principle?
And the Marbleheaders would say it's the Bristol fishery that they're acting on their self-interest to squelch ours. So their self-interest is bad, ours is good.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably the way self-interest generally operates.
It's tax time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the story I tell in Minutemen and Their World is far less about interests of specific individuals and groups than about whole community. So when I wrote the Minutemen and Their World, so long ago that I'm now as old as the geezers who showed up at this 1825 commemoration. And when I wrote it, in a pre-internet age, and I did compare Concord to other places, but not in a systematic way that now it would be easy to do and you really have to do. So I portrayed a town that was slow to come to a radical stance. And that was a revelation to me, and because no other book had ever showed that. And it mattered since Concord and Lexington, we can get into that, were the places where the first shots were fired and returned.
Yes.
And so if Concord wasn't so radical, how do we then understand its place at the epicenter of the revolution? Well, okay, so what I discovered, and I've elaborated on the new edition of the Minutemen and Their World, is Concord was actually a fairly conservative place. It did not participate in most of the pre-revolutionary protests against British taxes and enforcement measures. So I looked at other places. Okay, Acton, incorporated by being hived off from Concord. It pretty much followed Concord's course, except even more. From 1763 to 65 or 6, and from 1767 to 1770, to 1767 and 1773, Acton sent no representative to the legislature. Just think about that. Was it a conservative attempt to stay away from the protest? They never issued a statement on the Stamp Act. By contrast, Lexington was militant from the very start. The real, and in 1765, Lexington doesn't just adopt the Braintree Resolves, which many communities did when John Adams wrote them. Rather, they wrote their own, or probably the minister Jonas Clark wrote them. And they're ferocious in the determination to stand up against tyranny, to be true to the legacy of their ancestors, and to put their lives on the line. Concord apparently adopted the Braintree Resolves, instructed the town clerk to put them in the town book, and he never did. And the next year, 1766, when it was time to elect representatives to the General Court, Concord's representative, Charles Prescott, was singled out in the press as a friend of the Stamp Act. Concord re-elected him. So, and I could go through the litany, but that would subject you to being back in high school, having to memorize all the acts. So, but the broad story is Lexington, and I'll just say, Lexington, after the Tea Act, gathers up all the tea in town and burns it on the Common 4 days before the destruction of the tea off of Griffin's Wharf. Lexington, smaller than Concord, not a very significant town at the time, is really militant. Concord, a center of trade and courts, is moderate to conservative. And you could see one reason why Lexington has always resented Concord dominating the story of the battle. They were the people who bring on the battle, not the people from Concord.
Right, right.
Are there
Yes, I'm so glad I planted you there. Concord as a trading center, as merchants, and as a government center, has justices of the peace, and as a military center, has militia high officers who all have appointments from the crown. And I realized this in the first version of Minutemen, but even more so when I was tracking who held slaves from the 1771 valuation list. When you do that, you discover, not surprisingly, that economically wealthy people at the top of the tax list held slaves. Everybody said that. People have missed the point that most people in the top of the wealth bracket didn't own slaves. So what distinguishes them? They were not only wealthy, they were speculators in townships in the western part of Massachusetts. And they were esquires and colonels and appointees from the royal government. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized these are people who identify with the British Empire, that they're proud to be British American subjects of the king. And the investment in slaves, one or two people held in bondage, was more of a way to display their status and their being part of this really worldwide empire than that they were exploiting for economic gain in the way we would think of with plantations. And it seemed to me, the more I thought about it, that this group of people were torn between their local identification and their cosmopolitan imperial identity.
So is the revolution then focused on preserving a local as opposed to a cosmopolitan identity?
Yeah, and what I would say is that the people we're talking about most of them are torn. Mm-hmm. You know, that a good many, the way I learned to study this is that after Britain closed the port of Boston, the Boston Committee of Correspondence drew up a solemn league and covenant to circulate in each town for individuals to say, I pledge not to buy or sell any British goods. A lot of towns ignored it, but Concord, despite its having been moderate and conservative, did adopt it, though they watered it down. And I was able to identify all the people who signed, put them on the tax lists, compare them to those who didn't sign. 20% didn't sign. And there were many of the people in the elite of the town. But almost all of them stayed after the battle. Only a couple people became loyalists. And so my view is that people are really torn internally between loyalty to the locality, which their families have been based, and connection to Britain. I think what I would speculate is that for many of these people, and in general, you can be cosmopolitan, but what happens when you really come to the conclusion that you will always be a second-class subject of the British Empire?
And that's what happens to a lot of go to England. They discover they're really not British, they're American.
Yeah, exactly. And there must have been people who say, I could have told you so.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what you have is communities locally rising up. The trigger is not the long sequence of things from the Stand Back to the Townsend duties and so on. It's the passage of the Massachusetts Government Act in punishing Massachusetts and Boston for the Tea Party. And here's where my own ambivalence as a historian. Do I identify with or detach from people I'm writing about? Comes in. The Massachusetts Government Act takes the council, which had been chosen by the members of the Assembly, and turns it into a body appointed only by the royal governor and the crown. But the councils in royal governments had already been elsewhere chosen by the crown. So it's no big change, except for Massachusetts. The real changes in the Massachusetts Government Act are that the courts and the whole judicial system are made instruments of the governor, appointed and paid by the royal government. And in addition, the legislature, the lower house, can meet as it's prescribed in the charter, but the governor has the power to dismiss it at any time. Meanwhile, the Massachusetts Government Act says towns can no longer meet except once a year to elect their municipal officers. If they want another meeting, they have to submit the agenda to the governor for his consent. Well, what they were trying to do is make sure the towns couldn't meet and discuss public policies imposed by Britain. So, think about this. Oh, and let's add that when the Massachusetts Government Act becomes known in law in Massachusetts Bay, how are towns going to protest? You can't have a town meeting. And the governor has called the legislature but immediately dismissed it. So how will you get out your voice? Well, you can have a county convention. But it turns out General Gage issues a proclamation saying they're illegal and criminal and treasonous. And you can have a provincial congress. And General Gage issues a proclamation saying they're illegal and criminal and treasonous. So, and the whole judicial branch is in the hands of the administration. If any of this starts to sound familiar, you can see why writing about the American Revolution is difficult. Because, it looks pretty clearly as if from our point of view, the opportunities for popular self-government are rapidly diminishing.
Yes. There's an episode when, actually I remember a few years ago, one of my students was wondering during a flap over some national issue, I can't remember now, people complaining about their rights being taken away and said, well, what rights actually have you lost? And I said, well, that's exactly what Thomas Hutchinson asked Samuel Adams. But he sees the way things were trending. I was just thinking about in 1770, when the First Continental Congress meets in 1774, and the delegates from Massachusetts, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, William Cushing, go to Philadelphia. Another guy from Massachusetts also shows up, the Reverend Isaac Backus. He's a minister from Middleborough, a Baptist minister, and he wants to know how come the Massachusetts Assembly Provincial Congress, which sent these guys, is taxing his congregation to support a church to which they don't belong. And here in Massachusetts, that wasn't really an issue for the Provincial Congress. We're all Congregationalists. Why would they object to taxing the Baptists to support the church in Middleborough? I don't know if anyone here is here from Middleborough, or are there any Baptists here or Congregationalists? But Congress takes an interest in this, and that was a big fear of these guys from Massachusetts. They were regarded as a bunch of wacky Puritans. And the leaders of Congress call in the guys from Massachusetts to meet with the Reverend Backus, because they think he has a legitimate point. And Robert Treat Paine says to Backus, it's not really an issue of principle with you, you just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, well, that's exactly what the ministry says about you. There's nothing worse when your own argument is used against you so effectively. So it does raise all of these issues. As you said, it raises the whole issue of slavery. It also raises this whole issue of who belongs in a community. Are the Baptists part of this body politic? And as we know, in Virginia, it really was the Baptists secure religious freedom through there, saying, okay, we won't participate in the revolution. And here in Massachusetts, it's something of a tougher road for them to secure their relief from taxation. And when Backus asks Robert Treat Paine, how come you don't pay taxes to support King's Chapel in Boston? Paine says, well, that would be ridiculous because we don't go to King's Chapel. And Backus says, we don't go to the Congregational Church. It raises these very serious questions that are going to have longer repercussions for us than the issue over the stamps or even tea.
Yeah, well, the fundamental problem is that people wanted self-rule, but they didn't want to change the ways they rule themselves.
Right. Yeah. We've been happy, as you were saying earlier, that they're arguing for a defense of their constitutional structure, but then the conventions, the congresses are all unconstitutional things that they're doing as a way to secure their constitutional structure.
Yeah, and that was a really big complaint that soon-to-be Loyalists had about the revolutionary movement. They said, you're so big on constitutional. What's these taxes are unconstitutional. These laws are unconstitutional. Well, where in the Constitution or the Charter do you happen to see provisions for county convention? They're unheard of. And what possible justification do you have for having the assembly communicate with the other assemblies? There's no provision for that. If you want to complain about British policies, elect your representatives to the General Court and have them put together a petition to the Crown, a humble petition to the Crown, asking for a redress. That's the legal constitutional way to make your unhappiness known. And they would have probably said, that's what makes the British Empire and British Parliament and King the best self-government in the world. So, basically, the Patriots ignored that protest. That argument of the soon-to-be Loyalists reminded me, when I got to think about it, of Vietnam anti-war protests when I was coming of age. Because there were all liberals who were opposed to the Vietnam War, but were seemingly even more opposed to the way it was being protested. And the argument was, work within the system. And effectively, the soon-to-be Loyalist argument is, work within the system. That's how you bring about change. I had one point of view when I was 22. I might have a very different point of view now.
Me too. Yes.
If you take March of 1770, the Boston Massacre, until the signing of the Declaration, from a Loyalist point of view, was there a tipping point before which they could have done something? If they said, we don't like the way this is heading, it looks inevitable, was there a tipping point where the Loyalists could have done something to prevent the inevitability of the revolution?
The best test case of this is the town of Weston, which was a hive of Loyalists. And the leader of the Loyalist faction, and they were not just Royalists but Loyalists, was Colonel Elisha Jones, who was elected to the legislature he'd been a long time representative, then he stepped away, and then he's back in 1773. He was the great-grandfather of Henry David Thoreau. So civil disobedience comes naturally in that family. he was a strong supporter of royal government, and he was a militia regimental officer. He's a partner in land speculation in townships with Colonel Charles Prescott, the guy who'd been the friend of the Stamp Act, who'd been reelected. He kept Weston's town meeting from ever making any strong statements. And he was ready to, and he blocked Weston from forming a committee of correspondence through the summer of 1774. And then all the pressure blew up. And at the end of September, Concord establishes a committee of correspondence. Weston does, and a whole lot of towns. So I think the answer is he built up political support. He used it behind the scenes as much as possible. But finally, these guys were in minorities.
Yeah, and in 1772, Boston's Committee of Correspondence issues a call to the other towns to join in opposing. Boston issues this report saying how British policies are violating their rights as men, as Englishmen, and as Christians. And they send this out to the towns, and most of the towns respond, even going further than Boston did. But then there are some which are supporting the governor. I mean, it really is less a struggle between Massachusetts and the Crown than it is between Thomas Hutchinson and everyone else here. It's very much a local struggle. And Hutchinson, he calls a meeting of the session of the Assembly hoping to quell this. And this is in January of 1773. And he gives a very long speech explaining to the Massachusetts Assembly why they don't govern in Massachusetts, that the Parliament governs. And I always think Hutchinson probably in another lifetime would have been a history professor, because what we like to do is give long lectures. And we know you were really smart if at the end of our lecture what you think, say, agrees with what we have just said.
And it'll be on the test.
And if for some reason you don't agree, what we do is we repeat it, but we speak slowly and use smaller words. And so Hutchinson also, I should say, wrote very long, boring books. In fact, the riot that destroyed his house in August of 1765, one of the things they found was the manuscript for the third volume of his History of Massachusetts Bay, and they threw that out into the streets. And one of his friends said, apparently they didn't want to read another volume of his wretched history.
You know, it should become known as the editor's riot.
That's But Hutchinson lectures them, and members of the Assembly aren't the same as a group of college undergraduates. They were sent there by their towns to represent their towns and not to listen to the governor or to think, well, if we're here but we don't actually have any power, why are we here? This is one of the moments that really does make what happens inevitable. Not to say that imagine if the Parliament had said, okay, you can have 3 representatives from the American colonies, even one from each colony. That would be 13 out of 450 or so members of Parliament. And then inevitably these guys would go to London, would live there, and would completely forget the people at home. But it would have taken defeated that entire argument about taxation and representation in a more effective way.
If only they could have learned about K Street.
That's right.
In Washington. And a lot of the failure rests with King and Parliament.
Yes.
I think that they could have negotiated themselves out of the war or delayed it a good many years. David Potter, the historian of the South and the Civil War, in one of his books, made the point that it matters to ask the question not why was there a civil war, but why did it happen when it did. Mm-hmm. Likewise, we can say about the American Revolution. Why did it happen when it did? Well, King and Parliament did not have to, in February of 1775, declare Massachusetts out of its protection. That is basically saying, you can do anything. It's like the Dred Scott decision saying black people have no rights that anybody's required to honor.
Right.
And that's what the Crown and Parliament did. In that sense, they made war inevitable. On the other hand, we still have to go back to the fact that Governor Gage is trying to avoid an outbreak of shooting in the beginning of a war, and so is the Provincial Congress. On April 19th, both on Lexington Common and in Concord by the Bridge, everybody is under orders, the Patriot militia and minute companies, that when more than 500 regulars are marching out into the countryside with their baggage and train of artillery, then you should form an army of observation, but not to initiate combat unless you're fired upon. So in Lexington, when the militiamen are dispersing in response to the order of Captain John Parker, because one, he sees they're too few to fight, and second, they're only supposed to form an army of observation. Likewise, in Concord, the minute companies march onto the bridge because they see smoke rising from the town center. They think the town is being burned, as the British regulars had boasted they would do, when they're actually putting out a fire that they had inadvertently started. So, wars often start out of misperception and miscalculation. And the misperceptions, we can say, are what are coded and determined, but not the final decisions.
Yeah, as we know from reading your book, the Concord militia had marched out of town as the British were marching in, and then turned around and actually led them into town, because that was their role in this military hierarchy.
Beating, playing fife and drum as they led them into town. Said Amos Baer, we had grand music.
And of course, in February of 1775, you had another attempt to get a cannon from Salem.
Yeah.
And that neither side wants to provoke a war. So
And what was called Leslie's Retreat. And I love that because Gage sends Colonel Leslie out with his regiment to seize the weapons in Salem. At the North River in Salem, the militia, made up mostly of men from Marblehead, meet them and have an armed standoff. And Leslie retreats. Had there not been the retreat, the war would have started at a North Bridge.
At a North Bridge, yes.
But not in Concord, but in Salem. And we'd be knowing much more about the Marblehead sailors who were also soldiers in Colonel Glover's Continental Regiment, which was the only one that could operate on land and sea.
And of course, in February, Parliament is debating what to do about Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, they heard first about Lord Chatham's proposals for conciliation with the colonies, the former William Pitt. And so we get the news, notice how we say we when we're talking about these folks? The news of the possible conciliation, but what Parliament had passed was, let's get tough with these people. So the first news we have is possible reconciliation, but then what comes instead is a bigger army and the outbreak of the war.
In a sense, the revolution was a powerful challenge to British identity and pride. And if for many colonists, it's both a moment, the gentlemen and merchants and elites in Concord, that's going to be a moment of where do you choose. For other people, you're recognizing that who you've been all along. So identities as well as interests and ideas matter here. But we might turn this in a different direction. So the more I've studied Massachusetts in the crisis of 1774 or 75, the more it seemed to me almost an ancestral war about duty to the Puritan ancestors who fled the tyranny of Archbishop Laud and Charles I, crossed the ocean at great hazard, made their way into the howling wilderness, fought bloody wars with the natives, or at other times acquired their property by other means, and then finally established, at great loss of treasure and blood, a legacy of civil and religious liberty for themselves and their posterity. And it is our duty to pass that on to our posterity. Well, that's not a revolution that would reach out to enslave black people who were seeking liberty from the general court. Their ancestors did not exactly cross the Atlantic in the same way. So the question then becomes, people in Concord and elsewhere say, we want our charter rights back. If that's all they wanted, what does this have on offer to people in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and the other colonies? And how do you go from, we want our charter back in 1775, to we hold these truths to be self-evident in 1776? How does that transformation occur? It's all the more pertinent a question because all 6 Massachusetts signers of the Declaration of Independence had been in that provincial Congress whose statements all played on the ancestor theme.
Right. I guess we're throwing that out to the audience because that is the big question. How do you get from this and how do you bring in not only the other colonies, but then make this a universal declaration? That is, the Declaration talks about all men, and it's not
Right.
just us.
We have to go from having political cartoons about the awfulness of an Anglican bishop being allowed
Right.
into Massachusetts to 20 years later having a Catholic church in the middle of Boston.
In 3 months after the Declaration of Independence, Concord responds to the general courts, still extra legal without a constitution, request to towns to tell them whether it'd be okay for the legislature to write a constitution. Concord meets and says no. And their explanation is as follows. You're not a proper body to write a constitution that sets the ground rules of government. You should have towns elect delegates to a convention that will draw up a frame of government that will then be presented to the towns for ratification. Concord is the first town anywhere in Massachusetts, or maybe anywhere in the Republic, to lay out the plan that became the normal American way of writing and ratifying constitutions.
And of course, the legislature ignored that.
And they said no.
Wrote a constitution.
And it was turned down.
The towns rejected it. They said, listen to Concord.
And that delay was really valuable because the 1780 Constitution had no racial restrictions in it. The 1777, 78 did. But how did, so building on, and the universal rights, Concord, which just said it wanted to be true to the ancestors, just wanted the charter back, when it held that meeting saying, no, you can't write a constitution, to prove they meant it, they invited every male 21 and older, whether or not he met the property qualifications, to participate in that town meeting that took that vote. And yet, when they ratified the Constitution, they had no problem with property qualifications that were really stiff. So this is either a crazy town, which people visiting today might conclude, or how people understood self-government, of what was universal and what wasn't. just had very different meanings to them than we would put.
Another town, there should be really a historian of Concord who would look into this and explain to us what it's all about. Barnstable is another interesting town because in June of 1776, the Provincial Congress asks the towns to consider how they should vote on independence. And towns do debate this in their town meetings. And Barnstable votes against it for very good reasons for Barnstable, but very embarrassing to the Patriots since one of the leading figures of Massachusetts politics was James Otis Sr., who was often the moderator of the town meeting, and his son James Otis Jr. and his daughter Mercy Otis Warren both have statues built now in Barnstable. But the real question was, there's actually another, is anyone from Barnstable? I should ask that before I get. And Barnstable, according to our proceedings of the Colonial Society, was the only town that didn't vote in favor of independence. I'm told there were other towns that also did not. Usually it's someone in the next town who says, the people over there didn't vote in favor of this. There's another Patriot family in Barnstable, the Crocker family, and the Crocker Tavern, according to local lore, was the Faneuil Hall of Cape Cod, where the Otises and the Crockers got together to debate, to plan for independence. And there are saber marks in the beams of the Crocker Tavern building that still stands, which according to local lore were made by a Redcoat regiment that marched into Barnstable to break up one of these meetings. And the saber marks are there, but the rest of the story is not true. Because if the Otises and the Otises and the Crockers did meet at the Crocker Tavern, but they absolutely hated each other. And it begins with a brawl on the militia training ground because Joseph Otis, another of the children of James Otis Sr., was a captain in the militia. Seth Crocker was a captain in the militia. And they're on their training ground in preparation for this war we all know is coming. And someone on the Crocker side didn't salute Captain Otis. And of course, the Crocker said, well, he's not our captain. And the Crocker said, but he is a captain, and you have to salute him. And probably not shockingly, a group of guys with weapons who probably had been drinking then attack each other. And the Crockers flee into the safety of the Crocker Tavern, pursued by the Otises. And it's the Otises who make the marks in the beams. And this is some weeks before the town meeting to debate independence, and Edward Bacon, who is another very important local figure, and he's presiding over the town meeting and says, what happens if we don't have someone to arbitrate between Otises and Crockers? You'll have them killing each other. Is that really what you want? And the town says, no, that's not what we want at all. So not only do they vote no on saying yes to independence, they also choose Bacon to be their representative to the Provincial Congress, which refuses to seat him because he's not in favor of independence. And they say, tell Barnstable to send someone else. So he goes back to Barnstable and says, they say to send someone else. And the people of Barnstable says, well, wait a minute. They tell us who can represent us. The big question for Barnstable, it's a long story about town history. I'm hoping you'll retire to Barnstable next, Bob, and tackle what's happening there.
Something a little off about that story. And that is, most towns didn't vote on whether independence was a good idea. The Provincial Congress asked towns to give them opinions.
Yes.
Concord never met.
Yes.
And there was a project that was being launched a few years back for funding so that each town would research its records to report the vote on independence. It never got funded, so it didn't happen. But my impression is most towns actually didn't respond.
When Barnstable was challenged as to why they didn't support it, they said, well, we didn't say yes, we didn't say no. It was, will you instruct your delegate?
Yeah.
And they said, no, we're not going to instruct our delegate. So, but Joseph Otis, sorry to bring this up, then turns this into an attack on Bacon for being against it. I was trying to simplify the story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it is a curious thing that why would a town like Concord, which whose minister, William Emerson, read the Declaration of Independence from the public, as the ministers were asked to do. Why they wouldn't gather a couple months before, having already been the scene of the battle, just unclear. The other point you're making here, and this was the origin of the Minutemen and their world in many ways, how people divided up had much to do with ongoing conflicts and feuds, loyalties, as well as interests. You know, we know that. You know, if you're for it, I'm against it. You know, we hated your family for decades, and nothing you can do is ever going to change our mind. You know, lots of places like that. And so, to study the American Revolution as if it's a national event that has brief landings in little communities and takes off again, is to write about it the way once the national news media, CBS and NBC, would cover disasters or controversies. Dan Rather and his crew would fly in, be in a town for 2 days, and then leave, and never have asked the question, what was this place like before we covered it, and what were the consequences of the event? That was why I came to write the Minutemen. It seemed to me, wow, what do we know? You know, to say James Barrett was the colonel and John Buttrick was the major, they had farms. Well, you could have reversed their roles, and everybody, they're just names on whom we project an image of who's the farmer and who's the merchant. But farmers have histories, and merchants have histories, and widows have histories. And if you don't put them in the stream of time, you create a set of stereotypes that you then manipulate and think you've revealed something when you've just revealed your own lack of interest in really pursuing. That was what I had in mind when I was a wise guy caught up in the anti-war movement.
Further thoughts from those of you who have been listening so patiently? It is the season of Lent, and you've been doing penance.
I'm
David.
wondering about the Hutchinson as an issue and how the drama of Hutchinson's purported conspiracy to unseat the government, the charter government of Massachusetts, how that doesn't change minds and add an ideological, well, Balin calls it an ideological switchboard. These events turn people's minds, and I'm wondering how Hutchinson fits in with your interest versus conviction.
I think you're absolutely right. Held a lot of people like Elisha Jones and Charles Prescott in the interest of government. It's they trusted Hutchinson.
Yes.
And they thought, he'll act in our interest. And the exposure of his letters discredited him and caused his rapid loss of influence. And that, I think, becomes internally the political breaking point.
Yes.
Even though in Barnstable, it was the Otises who are said to have been so angry that Otis didn't get the Chief Justiceship instead of Hutchinson.
Right.
That sparks the whole thing in the first place.
And then you can see repercussions of that, because when Hutchinson leaves, people who had the bad sense to sign a letter thanking him for his service, they then are condemned for that. They signed the governor's letter, and Bacon is one of these guys who might have been.
So is Charles Prescott of
Yes,
Congress.
right.
And he's mobbed on the town common.
Yes, right, yeah. And so Hutchinson really is the big loser of the revolution. You know, we've had a special relationship with Great Britain since 1815 with a few bumps, as Anne will know. But yes, you have then Hutchinson, though, and Peter Oliver, when he writes his history, saying the whole thing was caused because Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. hated Hutchinson and they brought down the whole fabric of the Constitution as a way of getting there.
On the other hand, what Hutchinson's letters revealed was that he had long been calling for the Massachusetts Government Act.
That's right, yes.
He was for weakening local self-government, denying town meetings the powers to do all the things they claim to do, making the council appointive. And so, and as had Francis Barnard as governor.
Yeah.
So you had a long history.
And William Shirley had also
Yeah.
wanted to amend the Massachusetts Constitution to prevent these constant town meetings. But Hutchinson happens to be the one when it happens.
If they hadn't stopped picking on town meetings, people would have said, oh, too many town meetings, we're not going.
That's right. Well, thank you all for joining in this conversation.
Thank you.
And we can continue it over drinks and more snacks.